Today on The State of Us, Ukraine and Russia, 100 days into the war. What's next? Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, today by Mr. Lance L. Jackson, our senior resident historian here at True Chat, and more commonly known as your friendly redneck liberal. Today, we're going to continue a conversation that we've been having now for a few months, and that is about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how that war is progressing. We're going to take a look at kind of how it has developed so far, what we know about all that has happened. Then we're going to talk about what's going on right now, and then the implications for that sort of on a global scale, how that continues to affect other areas. So if you haven't been keeping up with what's going on in Ukraine, you're going to get a good recap of that. For those that have been paying attention, I think it'll be a helpful refresher. Certainly some details in here. There's been a lot of stuff, obviously, since this has started that I think are good to keep at the forefront of our minds and talk about what the goals are for each side and where that may take us. So there's a lot to get into, Lance. But before we dive in, do we have a word of the day?
We do. The word of the day is revanchism or revanchist. Okay. Both have three syllables, revanchysm or revanchist. Obviously, ism is a belief and an ist describes a person. So revanchism means the revengeful spirit moving a defeated nation to aggressively seek restoration of territories. So, I've been struggling for the past 2 or 3 months for a decent word to describe Vladimir Putin. I think revanchist is a great descriptor of him, wanting to return Russia to its pre-1991 power.
A good word today. I think one that probably a lot of people have maybe never heard at all. So revanchist. So let's start, Lance, by looking at, and there's an article linked, folks, at thestateofus.org. It's Wall Street Journal, and it's kind of, it's a good piece on 100 days. It's not too long, but it's got a good bit of detail. We're going to share a little bit from there about kind of the history so far of where things are at with Russia. So Russia started its invasion on February 24th of this year with rapid airborne and motorized assaults targeting Kyiv and other big cities in Ukraine's north, combined with offensives on several other fronts. Moscow's forces soon grew overextended, and Ukrainian fighters showed unexpected skill using high-tech small arms provided by the West, such as Javelin anti-tank rockets and Stinger shoulder-launched anti-aircraft missiles. Russian forces withdrew from northern Ukraine in early April after taking heavy losses and regrouped for a more concentrated attack in the east. Now, in the open landscape of Donbas, Ukrainians can't execute the sort of skirmishing tactics that effectively defeated Moscow's forces around Kyiv. Recent fighting has shown that large quantities of artillery can enable Russia to grind out limited gains. Mr. Zalenskyy has begged Western governments for more and better weapons. The U.S. is obliging, though more slowly than Kyiv wants. So kind of a very brief overview of how it's gone so far. Obviously, the fighting now, right, Lance, is focused in the eastern part of Ukraine, which is where some of those, depending on what terminology you want to use, breakaway regions and or regions that Russia had kind of seized with insurgents pre-full-scale invasion, sort of building off of that and trying to secure other areas in Russia's east and secure the land bridge that the east has with Crimea, whilst also, right, cutting Ukraine off from its access to the sea.
By cutting off their access to the sea, then they can't trade. And if the Ukrainians can't trade, then they have a hard time coming up with any money to continue the government functions of everyday life, of providing people with, roads and heat and electricity and all of those things. So, when we last talked, the Russians were pulling out of Kyiv, and everybody was up in arms, celebrating like, yeah, we stood up. Look at these Russian troops aren't as good as they thought they were. They overextended. Maybe they're a little green. And we all wondered, okay, where's Putin going next? And now we found out. And obviously working in a more open environment has allowed the Russian superior firepower to take effect. It appears that the close in-city urban fighting, the Ukrainians can hold their own and actually inflict a lot of damage on the Russian army. And that's why for this different kind of war that the Russians have chosen to fight, which is a good move on their part. I don't mean that good and a pat them on the back, but a strategic move where they can gain some victories, some wins, and gain some territory. The Ukrainians rightfully now are saying, we need different weapons. We need more of them. We need them quickly, because obviously the Ukraine idea is they want to push the Russians out and retake Crimea. That would be their ultimate goal in the Ukraine, so that they could then maybe negotiate a peace and some kind of settlement that would recognize Ukraine into the future. So you have a war going on, right? I mean, you have one group who's probing and seeking the weaknesses of the other, and you have the group that's being attacked, fighting back, trying to push them out of their country so that they can then get back to business of being a country and not being attacked again.
President Zalenskyy of Ukraine said last Thursday that Russia controls 20% of his country currently. So that may not sound like a large portion, but to your point, Lance, part of what you have to keep in mind is that what Russia has seized is much of the industrial heartland of Ukraine, and many tracts large areas of its fertile farmland. It's also pretty successfully blocked Ukraine's access to the sea, which is needed for exports worldwide. So basically, that's threatening to leave Ukraine next to not viable at all as a state, and would be totally dependent on foreign assistance to the tune of what they need right now, which is like $5 billion every month just to cover essential government services and keep the battered economy functioning. That's just kind of like the minimum, right? I mean, that's not what they actually need.
That's bare bones.
Yeah, because that's outside of like arms and humanitarian aid, right? So it's a good bit more than that. The issue obviously is that if you cut off their farm exports and their industrial exports, which is the area that Russia has mired in conflict right now, and you cut off their ability to export, even the stuff that they still have and can still make, they don't have a good, effective way to get out of the country to get it to people who can buy it. So there's a lot of different issues there. And to your point, strategically, it makes sense why Russia obviously is pushing in this area. They also obviously seized Crimea back in 2014, and I'm sure they would like to build off of that by trying to secure that foothold and prevent obviously Ukraine from entering that area. So I think the economic side is a real challenge for both countries. Probably though, at least initially, more so for Ukraine, because to get back up on their feet at some point, they probably can't give in on access to the sea, right? I mean, like they got to get access to ports and some of their industrial areas back if they're to ever be, a thriving, viable, self-sustaining country. Because without those things, they have no real good way to support themselves.
Well, and I think the West is starting to realize that Ukraine is going to need more help. The United States, Germany, France are restraining themselves because they do not want, and they've stated they do not want direct warfare with Russia. So we have another, I don't know, for lack of better comparison, Middle East situation occurring here where one side goes to war, think Afghanistan, where the Russians went in to Afghanistan and we supported the Muhadan rebels to take on Russia. And they did, and the Russians left, and then we had to go in and fight, and then the Russians supported the rebels against us. And after 25, 30 years of fighting, then we all just left, and everything's the same as it was before. And that appears where this is headed, because nobody seems to have the stomach to go in and crush this revanchist leader, Vladimir Putin, and put him in his place and say, you're not going back to the glory days that you remember your country from having. We're not going to allow that. We fought the Cold War. We defeated communism at that time. Russia became a democracy. We created freedom for all of these other states that were part of the Soviet Union, and they want to remain free, and you can't make things up to where they want to come back to you. And you're not going to be able to, we're not going to allow you to force them to come back to you, because that's, in my opinion, exactly what's happening. Vladimir Putin is trying to recreate the old Soviet Union. And why did we fight the Cold War if we're going to allow this to happen? But instead, we're going to say, well, we won't fight directly in it. We're going to support the people that are fighting, sort of, so the fight can continue. I don't get it. If we're going to support them, let's support them all in.
So the question is also, how has Russia been impacted by this? We talked a little bit about Ukraine and some of their struggles, but obviously it's no secret that a lot of sanctions have been rolled out where, to build on Lance's point of we're sort of, the West is dipping its toes in the water, so to speak, with the conflict, right? And now maybe we're getting our legs down in there, but we're hesitant to jump in and join them. So the question becomes, who's going to outlast who, right? And in this case, President Putin has also indicated that he seems to think this is going to be a test of will. So let's look a little bit closer at that. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. The Wall Street Journal reports that Ukrainian President Vladimir Zalenskyy marked 100 days of war with Russia in a very somber but defiant video message. He said, "The armed forces of Ukraine are here. Most importantly, our people, the people of our nation, are here. We have been defending our country for 100 days already. Victory will be ours. Glory to Ukraine." Simple, but I do think very important in what we had talked right before the break about, Lance, which is that this is still going on, right? I mean, just because the media is not covering it the way they were, doesn't mean that thousands and thousands of civilians still haven't been killed, that Russia's not still in an invasion posture of a country that didn't ask for this and has no interest in being part of Russia.
Well, it just in the piece, there was this anecdotal where a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a church, a Greek Orthodox, a Russian Orthodox church, had been destroyed by Russian missiles and almost 200 people killed. People seeking asylum in a church, and the Russians are like, yeah, well, the church is in a neighborhood where we want to take it, so we're just going to send missiles in and destroy it. So, yeah, there's war going on, people, okay? This isn't a video game. This is real stuff. And if you Google urban street fighting, that's what's going on now in the next major city that the Russians wanted. And that's a dirty affair for everybody.
Something for people to understand, right, is this is the biggest conflict between European states since the end of World War II. And you might say, well, okay, but I mean, why does that really matter to me and inflation and gas? Well, part of it is because, the other thing that's brought up, I think, frequently, Lance, is right. Well, the United States really isn't that dependent, obviously, on Ukraine or Russia for our oil, are we? No. However, we are part of a world economy, and the global oil problems affect our oil prices. And even more than that, and this is the thing that I'm not sure is being talked about enough, Lance, is the upending of post-World War II and post-Cold War norms, right? I mean, we arrived at a place in the world where, there were conflicts in the Middle East, but there's always been conflicts in the Middle East. So, and not to diminish those at all, by the way, but I'm just saying, I think that's kind of the world's attitude is the Middle East is the Middle East is the Middle East. And that's always been that. But as far as Europe went, and it was pretty well established that, this is kind of how this is going to operate. These non-third world countries, right, have kind of come to this agreement on, I mean, we're going to do our posturing with Russia and we're going to, trade jabs and whatever, but we're going to trade and we're going to transact business wise and the food, the global food economy, right? That's all going to cross borders, agriculture, all of that's going to take place, And
and most of those countries, the majority of those countries were allies to the United States and worked with us to make things better, not only for them, but for those of us living in the United States as well.
And even with adversaries like Russia, I mean, you saw obviously many American companies that took up residence in Russia and started to bring services to their citizens. So there was a lot of, even though it's not like we were allies with Russia, right? And even though that relationship has been contentious, there's been a lot of sort of quote unquote normalcy, right? Folks, this is one of those change right impostures. I went to Russia, right? And my parents adopted a Russian child who is my brother. And you can't do that now. I mean, that's how much it's changed in just, less than 20 years. I couldn't go to Russia now if I wanted to. And an American certainly couldn't adopt a Russian child. I mean, just that's how much it's just that relationship has changed. And then you say, well, what has that got to do with inflation? It's upending world norms and expectations, right? We all arrive at that place of comfort and saying, well, the world is, there's bad stuff going on, but the major world powers, right, mostly work it out. Their jockeying is not armed conflict, and you don't have China or Russia or the United States. They're not invading other countries and seizing territory outright and openly. And then Russia did Crimea, and it was maybe that's just a one-time kind of thing. And of course it's not, obviously. But I think that's part of the struggle too, right? Is because part of what's driving inflation and supply chain issues is countries are rethinking how much do we want to be integrated globally? Because this war makes us nervous. Not only does it have real economic implications in changing the world's supply of oil, but moreover, emotionally, and we've talked about how the stock market, right, and the economy are so driven by emotion, people are uneasy about, and I mean, I hear that in our country, right? And I'd be lying if I said I hadn't felt that myself. Well, it seems ridiculous that I'm going to have to wait this long to get this electrical equipment, even though 90% of it is made here because this stupid, 10% that I need isn't made here. I can't get this thing and it's going to delay my project, 10 months. I understand that frustration, but then what does that lead to? Well, then we just need to make it here. Okay, well, that's going to be very costly because we're going to have to start businesses that we haven't had here in decades, right? We're going to have to find people to work for them. There's a labor shortage. All of that does what? Drives up inflation. And
people are scared and trepidatious of the future and what to do when the future is unknown. And to your point, the normalcy that was, you could pretty much predict the ebb and flow and what was going to happen and make some long-term plans. And okay, things will be bad for a couple of months. But when you have a war like this that has upset the economy across the world, then people are afraid to pull the trigger to do anything to move forward. And they start to cut things and they start to raise prices. And then that affects, the consumer's like, I'm not going to buy this new furniture now and I better do this. And then all of a sudden there's no need to make all this stuff. So those people lose their job. Well, now they don't buy as much stuff and it's a chain reaction. And that's what this does. And you have to realize we're coming out of COVID didn't just happen in the United States. It's happened across the world. And if you stay up on things, you know that China's just had a bout with it and closed one of its major cities in production. And that too has a ripple effect, right? And you say, well, but Americans, we don't buy Russian oil, so it doesn't affect us. So our Western allies are buying oil from Russia. We ask them to stop. They do. Then they have to go to other sources. Well, those sources are sources that we use or other people use. And so the demand is higher. So it goes up. And so it's a chain reaction that even though we're not directly affected, as Justin pointed out, we're affected because other people are affected, and it upsets the apple cart. And now people here in the United States are scared and wondering, well, what should my next move be? And until I'm sure what my next move should be, I'm not going to make any move. And then things start to slow down.
Russia is also facing, right, a deep recession in 2022 because of all these Western sanctions and the long-term erosion of its economic potential. Because, again, you put these sanctions in place, but what happens and the damage, not just to the economy, but the economy's reputation, right? I mean, Russia has struggled since the fall of the Soviet Union to establish a good place in the global market as an economy that matters, and we've covered that at different points, once obviously one of the more influential economies in the world, and that erosion has been underway. This only further complicates that because you have all these companies that have pulled out, who are going to be very skeptical to ever go back, right? Because it's like, well, we gave this a try, right? Post-Soviet Union, like we gave this a go, and then when you wanted something different and it was no longer convenient for you to play by the rules that you set up, you just destroyed all the rules and started invading other countries. And we're not, we don't want to be in that position.
But history shows us that the Russian people are used to doing without and standing in long lines.
Yep.
So will this be different this time? And that's one of those outliers that I don't know that's interesting to watch, because the old time Soviets are like, well, we've always stood in line. Well, we've always not had enough food. We've not had enough fuel. We're used to this. Will the younger generations who grew up in glasnost and perestroika, the freedom and the touch of capitalism that Russia had after 1991, are they going to allow Vladimir Putin to put them back into the lives of their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, of standing in line and making the ultimate sacrifice for Mother Russia? I think that's a key piece, and I don't know what the answer is, but I think that's a key component to watch as this war continues to go on.
The article that we're referencing today says, quote, "The war has made the world poorer. By driving up food and energy prices, it has complicated the troubled global recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. The disruption of long-established energy and food supply relationships leaves much of the world facing a protracted and costly economic adaptation." The other thing to talk about here, too, is how this is causing rethinking amongst defense strategies, right? The past 100 days have prompted a rethinking of Europe's defense policies. Low spenders, like Germany and Italy, have vowed to reverse course. Finland and Sweden have applied to join NATO. The UK, at odds with the European Union over the terms of Brexit, has moved closer to the continent on defense. But this is what we see, right? I mean, historically in war, Lance, right? That is a time of, whether it's within somebody's own country or in a group of countries on the same side, displays of unity, right? Rallying together, so to speak, for defense.
Well, you pick a side.
Yeah.
Because people are fighting. So you have to pick a side, because otherwise you're going to be dragged into it anyway. So you want to have some choice of which side you're going to be helping or defending.
Well, and militarily speaking, you have two of the world's largest militaries somehow involved, right? And I say that because obviously U.S. troops are not directly involved, but we are involved by providing the most advanced military technology in the world is being provided for the defense of Ukraine against one of the world's other less formidable than we thought, right? But still, in terms of just sheer raw firepower, more powerful than many other militaries in the world.
And typically are willing to use it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there are others who have some firepower, but they may not necessarily be of that opinion. At the same time, though, Lance, and I think you mentioned this before, France and Germany are kind of skeptical about whether or not Ukraine can succeed. And I think this whole thing, because of where it's at, right, and this is really what I want to talk about next, where do we go from here? Because what it looks like is bloody slog, right? That's where we're at, is this could go on quite some time. So what does that mean for where the conflict is headed from here? Find out. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. Over 100 days into the Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the war with Ukraine to attempt to seize that country and make it once again part of Russia. Of course, Ukrainians don't seem to want that, Lance, and Russia doesn't care because they claim that, Ukraine doesn't know what they're saying and that they're lying. They're lying. I do think from the last segment, one thing that's tricky, and we've mentioned this, it's very important to reiterate, is that Russia's people really don't get the full picture of what's going on, right? And they really have very limited access to the full picture. So it's very hard because judging the Russian people for their lack of, open rebellion against their government is partly because their government, in this case Vladimir Putin, mostly controls the media, and therefore controls the message that they're hearing. And we might sit here and be like, well, they should know that they're lying, but how? You don't know what you don't know, right?
Well, we're fighting a revanchist nation and a revanchist leader. I mean, whether you want to blame the Russian people or not, the reality is they're trying to turn back the clock and go back in history and create something that they had once before, whoever's in charge. And so they have a goal, right? They have a meaning for this fight. And I think what we're going to see, it comes down to, and I hate to say it, but it comes down to politics. What's going to happen in the United States? We saw that Macron just got reelected as the leader of the president of France and came out and said, well, maybe things with Russia need to be worked out. And President Zalenskyy of Ukraine came back and said, wait a minute. You're going to say that Russia has a leg to stand on? But again, Macron wasn't saying that until he won re-election. Then when he won re-election, he started to vacillate a little bit about his standing on the war. Okay, we have midterm elections coming up in the United States. The war in Ukraine is not really on anybody's radar right now. It's all about getting reelected. But what's going to happen if we have a huge Republican landslide? What's going to happen if the Democrats hold on to power in the Senate? What does that mean? If it looks like President Biden's on his way out, will he change his tune if it looks like he's going to have a one-term presidency? If it looks like something happens and he's going to have a chance to win re-election, how does that change? So politics here in the United States and around the world are going to play a big role in what's done. I think what's going to happen is all sides are going to continue to supply the Ukraine as long as the Ukrainians can continue to fight on their own. The question's going to come when Ukraine finally runs out of resources or reaches the tipping point where the West is no longer willing to supply Ukraine. Then what's going to happen? Are the Western powers going to be in a political situation to where they say, we're going to step in and stop this revanchism from taking place? Or are they going to acquiesce and say, you know what, taking care of my own people is more important than taking care of the Ukrainians, and ideology doesn't matter. We're going to let Russia have what they want. We saw the world allow Russia to take Crimea in 2014. Is it going to be 2024, 2025? And the world throws up their hand and says, yeah, Russia can have Ukraine because we need things to, use your word, return to normalcy.
I mean, Ukraine has made it clear that the goal is to retake control of their country.
And even push back. Not just control, but push. When they say their country, they're including Crimea.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
They're including parts of the eastern Ukraine that Russia de facto has in many ways had some level of control over since before this started, and all the way into the Crimea Peninsula. So part of that, I think, that's important to understand too. And if I was a Ukrainian, I'm sure I would probably want that back as well. You know what I mean? And I am not faulting them at all for wanting something that was in fact theirs that Russia took from them. Arguably, totally without merit or without valid reason, and to no desire of the majority of the people that live in those areas. So I get that. But I think when we're talking about strategy and how this ends, if Ukraine continues to see some success and continues to push Russia back, my fear is that if they can't settle for close to what they had before this started, Russia can't accept anything less than that, right? Because if Russia can do stalemate and claim that, they did some liberation and whatever, if they have a way out, then maybe they stop, and that's a big maybe. You take back all of eastern Ukraine and you take back Crimea and you push Russia back to its own borders. My concern then is if the powers that be in Russia, not just Putin, but the people that support Putin, if they don't turn and get Putin out of there, I don't know what a leader like that does when you've done that to him. Total humiliation, they're already being humiliated pretty bad because they've put their military on display for the world and demonstrated that what we all thought was, which they were still a better military, is not so much true. They've proven their, ineptitude in many respects. And so I think that, you've already suffered that global world stage humiliation. If you totally lose, that's, again, you got a guy with access to nuclear weapons, right? So it depends on what your goal is. And to that end, that's from the beginning, I think part of the complication with deciding whether or not we get involved is, does that mean we're helping Ukraine take everything back or not? And if it is, are we ready for those consequences? The consequences that, by the way, notice they may come anyway. Because if Russia doesn't get what it wants, they have short-range tactical nuclear missiles. They may use those anyway.
How determined are they? And I think they're very determined. They're more determined than we are. And I think they, at least at this point, and, to your point of what is the outcome, President Biden is quoted as saying in the article that that's up to Ukraine. What victory is defined by the Ukrainians. So that means the United States, if it has thoughts, isn't sharing them. And we're just saying at this point, we'll support whatever Ukraine wants to do to declare victory. But I think that's going to change as well. Bottom line, we're going to have to support them more heavily than we are now. And will that be enough? Or to your point, will that just cause Putin to up the ante as to what he's willing to use? Are we just going to continue to see this escalation, and it comes down to who's going to blink first, right? And what happens, and I hope, but like you always say, we don't know what the thinking is. I hope somebody in the United States leadership is figuring out, okay, if the Russians do use these short-range tactical nuclear missiles, what's our response? And I hope it's more than just public outrage. You know, I mean, I hope, right? I'll give the government credit. I hope they're playing these scenarios out. At least somebody in the Pentagon is playing these scenarios out, saying, okay, here are our options. What are we going to do? And somebody knows what we're going to do now instead of waiting to decide after it happens what we're going to do. Because we all know that's when bad decisions are made. When you wait until you're in the middle of it to decide how you're going to react, that usually doesn't lead to a good outcome. You need to be prepared ahead of time, saying if X happens, we're going to do Y, and we're going to see it through to Z.
And to your point, it's so important that our leaders, right, particularly in this case, the person making the decision, President Biden, has thought through what to do, because you don't want leaders to have to make a snap decision in the minute that hasn't been considered.
Or an emotional decision.
Right. Not with nuclear weapons, right? I mean, that's, you don't want them to do that hopefully anyway, but especially not when you get to that point. And I think that's part of what Lance and I have contended since the beginning is we probably would have been better off just to have been involved from the beginning and gambled on that, having kept Russia from doing what they're doing. Now we're in it. We can't do that now, but we could still attempt a version of that, and we're not doing that either. The longer it goes on, the more desperate I think Russia will become, and I think that's what we all have to be very conscious and concerned about. I mean, I think Ukraine is desperate as well, but they don't have nukes. You know what I mean? So like, they're very reliant on us sending them weapons. So like they keep asking, and I think they're very desperate. But they gave up their nuclear weapons. And of course, I'm sure that there are those in their country that feel like that was a big mistake now, which is sad because the world would probably be a better place without nukes. But Ukraine gave those up under the guise of promise of security from Russia and the West. And we showed them. Russia and the West both failed spectacularly in showing them that they could trust giving up their nuclear weapons. So anyway, Lance, why do we have this conversation today? What was the point?
Well, because here at True Chat, we have a mission, and our mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. We've done that, I think, again here today. And if you've enjoyed today's show, or you have something you want to tell us that you disagree with us, make sure you email us at podcast@thestateofus.org. Tell your family and friends and the people you work with. And if they say, well, that sounds like something I would like to listen to, tell them as a podcast. They can find us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us is available Tuesdays and Thursdays as a podcast first thing in the mornings. We're also heard on the weekends on AM and FM radio stations across the country. Lance takes the victory today. And for The State of Us, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to producer Bradley Butch, and thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.